Hello and welcome to the Liverpool.com podcast with me, James Martin. I'm joined by Matt Addison, seemingly somewhere a little bit warmer than where I am. Honestly, start of July and I'm sat here in a jumper, very distressing. But hopefully, we can give you a bit of a summer lift with some talk about the Liverpool attack. We'll be discussing Anthony Gordon, of course, a hot topic at the moment. But before we dive into all of that, just a quick message from NordVPN. To get the best discount off your NordVPN plan, go to nordvpn.com/bloodred. Our link will also give you 4 extra months on the 2-year plan. There's no risk with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee, and you should be able to find that link in the podcast episode description box. Right, Matt, let's start. Anthony Gordon, where else? I mean, he's been the talk of the town, quite literally, I suppose, with the sort of Everton connection as well. Everyone's been talking about what it might mean, where he might fit in, whether it could really happen. You obviously don't see too many players who played for both. What do you make of it all?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think if it was likely to happen, it possibly would have already done so. Obviously, given the situation with Newcastle and PSR and all the rest of it. But I think he's definitely a player that would excite me. I think it's definitely, as we've discussed plenty of times on this show, a position in terms of forward areas, not necessarily nailed to it being a left-sided forward, but I think it's definitely a position that Liverpool need to look at adding to. That's before you consider some of the uncertainty that we'll, I'm sure, discuss around one or two of the other players in that forward line for Liverpool. But it's definitely a link that gets me excited. I think there's definitely interest from Liverpool's side in him as a player. It's just a case of can you do it for a realistic fee? What is a realistic fee? I think there's lots of questions that would come with it, but I can absolutely understand why Liverpool might be interested in Anthony Gordon. I think he's a brilliant player. I think he's perfectly suited to what Liverpool would want. And I know they've already got options on that left-hand side, but I don't know about you. I really do think he would be an upgrade, I think, for what Liverpool have got at the moment.
Yeah, I think I'd agree. It's a tricky one in terms of the output, because you look at last season and he obviously had an excellent campaign, double figures for goals and assists, which I think only 5 players managed to do in the Premier League, Salah being another one of them, which is always a good sign when you're in that sort of bracket, because not many are. But then you look at previous seasons and maybe it was a little bit more steady, let's say, but of course for most of that time he was in a hugely struggling Everton side and clearly was standing out in that side enough to earn that move to Newcastle in the first place. So yeah, it is an exciting link, and I think especially when, as you mentioned, some of the question marks over the other options in that position, Luis Diaz, I think from pretty much the moment he's joined, but certainly following that big injury, the question has been, does he still have the output that you kind of need as a Liverpool winger? He has, that ability to beat a man. He takes players on 1v1. He's probably the best in the Liverpool attack at actually sort of giving that dimension to the forward line, I suppose. But in terms of providing those goals and even those assists, the numbers maybe leave something to be desired. And that's maybe one of the big plus points about Anthony Gordon. Certainly if he can keep up and even scale up the numbers that he was producing last season at Newcastle. But yeah, as you say, a deal didn't happen before the end of June the 30th with those PSR considerations. June the 30th, for those who have somehow managed to remain blissfully unaware, is the sort of almost new kind of second deadline day, if you like, because of clubs who are close to that profitability and sustainability regulations limit. June the 30th is the cut-off point for including deals in the previous year's accounting window. So you need to make sales by then if you want to book big profits and get below those kind of allowable losses within the 3-year rolling period. But that's the boring financial side out of the way. The ironic thing, of course, being that the Premier League looks to be changing its rules in the near future. So soon there'll be a whole new set of rules that we need to get our heads around. But for the time being, clubs do need to make sure that they're remaining compliant with those existing PSR rules. Newcastle found other ways to do that. They sold Nkuba Minte to Brighton and, of course, Elliot Anderson for big money, a club record fee, to Nottingham Forest. So it'll be even harder to get a deal done now. It seems like a deal broke down originally because Liverpool was not interested in including Gerald Kwanzaa in any kind of pseudo swap arrangement. I assume you would be firmly with the club on that one, Matt.
Yeah, absolutely. I know you wrote something a couple of days ago along the similar lines, really, that it was just never, ever going to happen. It wasn't even a discussion within Liverpool. It was very much a case of that isn't going to happen. And why would it? Liverpool have got an asset there, which I think probably minimum 10 years of looking ahead of Jarell Quansah being at the heart of Liverpool's defence, really. You'd certainly expect that he can kick on and even if he stayed at the same level he is now for those 10 years, he would still, be right up there in, the top end of defenders that Liverpool can have. So, yeah, there was no chance really of that happening. The suggestion seems to be that if he wasn't to be included, then Newcastle would want a huge amount of money. We're not quite sure exactly what huge means in this case, but I think there was a suggestion elsewhere that Alexander Isak, Chelsea had asked about him and they were told sort of 120, 130 million, which I suppose you would probably put Anthony Gordon, given that he was Newcastle's player of the season last season, in a similar bracket. I think that would certainly be far too much for Liverpool to pay. But if it was more like 50% more than the 40, 45 million that they signed him from Everton from about 18 months ago, maybe that could be a little bit more of a sensible price tag to attach to him. But it's tricky, really, unless Anthony Gordon pushes for an exit, which probably wouldn't reflect particularly badly on him, considering it's not that long since he pushed for an exit from Everton to then do the same at Newcastle to force through this. It's possibly a little bit difficult to see how it would happen this summer. But, according to Transfermarkt and various other sources, Anthony Gordon only has a contract for another couple of years at Newcastle, which I do find interesting. I do wonder if this is possibly one that Liverpool could leave for this summer and maybe come back next summer, given the fact that he was a possible solution that Newcastle possibly could have reluctantly sold this summer to comply with PSR. I wonder, maybe he may have known about Liverpool interest on the one hand and possibly also be aware now that Newcastle were willing to sacrifice him if they had to. I wonder how that impacts, contract negotiations for him. You'd imagine that Newcastle would probably have to get on with that sooner rather than later, given he's inside the last couple of years of his deal. I wonder if this is one maybe that, maybe next summer, if he's only got 1 year left on his deal, maybe they can't quite, hold other clubs to quite so high in terms of a valuation for Anthony Gordon. So it's one that I don't think is necessarily dead in the water at the moment. It would definitely be exciting. I can definitely see why it makes sense for Liverpool. But, by then, I suppose maybe there might be another year of Luis Diaz. There's so many moving parts within this, but I think it's definitely one to keep an eye on in the future. Not least, I suppose, because Anthony Gordon supposedly is open to the move, and from what we gather, is a Liverpool fan and would be sort of interested by that as well. So, as much as the deadline has passed in a certain way for this transfer, I think it's definitely one that would intrigue me, I think, in terms of not necessarily this summer, but possibly the one after.
Yeah, Newcastle's almost shot itself in the foot in a way in terms of kind of dangling that move in front of him briefly. However briefly it has all kind of come to light that, we sort of knew he was a Liverpool fan. He's talked about Gerrard being his childhood idol before. He's talked about Anfield as having the best atmosphere, but it's very much sort of come to light that it seems like he would have been very keen on this move, and that what sort of can of worms that might open will remain to be seen in potentially, as you say, future transfer windows. But yeah, just to briefly give a bit more PSR context, it was always going to be a stretch for this to be their big PSR solution, because you mentioned the fee that they paid to Everton not all that long ago, and the way that the sort of accounting works with PSR is that comes off over the length of his original contract with Newcastle. I mean, up to a length of 5 years now after Chelsea's shenanigans prompted that particular rule change. But he's only been there 18 months. So if you think about the amount of that fee they paid that's actually been booked already, it's not very much. So any sale would have had to have been, way over and above the fee that they paid Everton in the first place to get them out of their PSR hole. So I suppose a similar situation with Isak, which is why they were quoting those kind of figures to Chelsea. So yeah, it's so strange that they even, according to some reports, came to Liverpool with this proposal when it was, a long shot to put it mildly in terms of actually getting them out of that hole. But yeah, as I say, opened up that possibility now for the future, and Gordon will be looking at it, Liverpool will be looking at it, and if, as you say, as we understand it, the contract does only run for another couple of years, then the best they can really hope for it is kicking the can down the road maybe another year or so, and then we'll very much be having that conversation again in 12 months' time. But for the time being, let's work on the assumption that we're not getting Anthony Gordon. As you say, it would be quite something if he agitated for two moves in such a short space of time. That then sort of brings the spotlight straight back onto Luis Diaz, which is a conversation we've had, in various guises a couple of times on this show now. But I think it's worth circling back to in the sort of context of this conversation we're having about the front line and what we might want it to look like under Arne Slot. Of course, he's the one whose position was most under threat by these kind of whispers of Gordon, if you like. Do you think that? Do you think that it's a case of if the opportunity comes up and someone like Gordon is available, Liverpool will look to maybe pull the trigger on Diaz, or do you think his situation is sort of being viewed a bit separately?
It's difficult to say, isn't it? I think it does perfectly encapsulate the conversations that we've had really over the last few weeks and months in terms of Diaz, in that I think neither of us are particularly desperate to lose Luis Diaz by any stretch. He was obviously Liverpool's first choice in that position last season. I think there is a conversation this summer in terms of Cody Gakpo maybe getting a bit more of an opportunity off that left-hand side in the future. But, either way, he's clearly, a very important player to Liverpool. The question was more a case of, is there an upgrade there? Is there a realistic opportunity for Liverpool to maybe go and get someone who is a bit more of a guarantee? I think that the one thing we haven't said so far on the podcast with Anthony Gordon is that he's 4 years younger than Luis Diaz. He's posting better numbers. Those two things obviously brought together makes almost the perfect package really in terms of finding that upgrade, even if, as we've discussed, it clearly wouldn't be a cheap deal to do. It could be part financed in some way by maybe Barcelona or PSG or whoever else might be interested in Luis Diaz. And obviously, there's other things that come into that as well in terms of the money that they would be able to offer, whether Diaz would be interested in going to France or elsewhere, whether he'd only be interested in a move to Spain and all of that sort of thing. But I think it just sort of sums it up neatly, really, in that there is potentially an opportunity for Liverpool to improve on him. But, as I mentioned before, I think it's not unrealistic to think that if Luis Diaz doesn't sign a new contract in the next few months, then maybe by next summer you're having to look at him, because I think by that point he'd only have a year left on his deal. You could then look at Anthony Gordon in a similar situation. There's possibly a one in and one out policy in terms of that forward line, partly because of the finances, but also because if you added Anthony Gordon, you'd probably have to shift Luis Diaz across to the right-hand side, which we have seen it at certain times. I wouldn't be against seeing a little bit more of him on that side if there was an opportunity, obviously needing to rotate Mohamed Salah a little bit more. But I think for me, it's more a case of getting the balance right. And I certainly wouldn't want Liverpool to have any less than the 5 senior forwards that they've got. I think we spoke a little bit a couple of weeks ago around sort of having possibly Diaz and Gakpo for the left, Núñez and Diogo Jota for the middle, and then maybe Salah and one more to play on the right. Whatever the kind of configuration is, really. I think absolute bare minimum, you need those 5. Probably in an ideal world, you'd go and get somebody who can play more on the right-hand side. That would be kind of my priority, assuming that Diaz stays. Obviously, if he goes, that changes things slightly. But I think it's just a case, really, of making sure you've got enough depth across all of those positions. And it doesn't need me to say that we know that at some point someone will get an injury, someone will be suspended, quite possibly at the same time. I think it's similar to the centre-back conversation that we had last week, really. It's a bit of a gamble if they don't increase their options, less so certainly than at centre-back. That's obviously much more urgent and more important. But in terms of that forward line, I think it would make a real difference, really, for Liverpool to just have that extra option. Not necessarily a left-sided forward, but certainly someone on the right. I think that would make a lot of sense, I think, for me this summer.
And in terms of extra options, we can definitely talk about potential ways of doing it in the transfer market, but is there a case as well for some of the younger players to maybe have increased roles this season? Of course, Ben Doak was unlucky with injuries, so it's maybe hard to assess where he is right now, but Jayden Dan's another one who had a bit of a breakthrough campaign, still very young, of course, but There are these players there, aren't there? Lewis Kumas, another one who did quite well. Bobby Clark seems to be more of a midfielder now, but has played a bit further forward as well. Are there any of those who you are sort of tipping to have that kind of breakthrough campaign and maybe even becoming that sort of sixth man, if you like, in the rotation?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know whether they would necessarily become the sixth person within that forward line, but I think there are, as you say, options. Ben Doak, I think, will depend largely on injury and what he can do during pre-season. Possibly it might be late in the window. Liverpool can make a bit of a decision with him in terms of a loan. I think there's him and there's Cade Gordon, who I think are in pretty much a similar boat. I think particularly if they both stayed, but even if only one of them stayed at Liverpool next season, not that they'd be sold, but they could potentially go out on loan. I think, for them, they're far too good for under-21s football. I don't really see how that would benefit them massively. Obviously, they could get little bits here and there for the first team, and you'd have the benefit really of being able to train with the first team in the week, which would be useful. But I think for both of those, really, a top-end championship loan would make a lot of sense to get regular minutes to do basically what Harvey Elliott did. And I think both of those two are ready, certainly for that. I think Kumas and Dans, as you mentioned, will get minutes probably in the domestic cups. Whether they're quite ready to go out on loan, possibly they are. I think what we saw from them last season, not just in the Carabao Cup final, but obviously in that in particular, they did look ready for that next step. But I think for them it's a little bit less urgent. I think Cade Gordon and Ben Doak are slightly older, slightly physically more ready probably to go out and have a full season in the Championship. That would certainly interest me and just to see what happens really with them. But it's tricky because we don't quite know what Arne Slot's feelings on it will be. We don't quite know what pre-season is going to look like. There's probably going to be quite a few late transfer decisions, I think, with some of these players, not least because some of them won't be back straight away. Obviously, Ben Doak's missed the Euros through injury, but even if he'd have been away, he wouldn't be back day one on pre-season. We don't quite know where he's up to with his injury recovery. So there's definitely a number of talents there, but I think if you said to me in terms of Gordon and Doak, is it more likely that one of them becomes the sixth man or more likely that they go out on loan, impress, and maybe that can happen in 12 months? I think probably more so the latter.
And I suppose the other name to mention in that particular conversation is Fabio Cavallo, who did go out on loan last season, 6 months. At Leipzig was not especially successful. That got cut short, but then 6 pretty fruitful months at Hull, it has to be said. You can maybe draw a few parallels to that kind of Harvey Elliott season, albeit for a shorter length of time. He did very well. He had good numbers. And so, you can probably conclude that I think it's probably fair to say, you might disagree on that, but he's sort of better than Championship level. I think he looked too good for that level of football. But then, of course, at the same time, it seems as though he wasn't quite ready for the top end of the Bundesliga. So does that mean that you're in a position to go into the Liverpool squad? I suppose that's another question for Slot in pre-season, is it?
Yeah, I mean, I do like him as a player. I do think he's very, very good. He's the kind of player that I like to watch, and I think he was really impressive when he came through at Fulham, and it was a bit of a backward step. Like you say, he is too good to go into the Championship, but ultimately, if you're barely, not just not starting, but not really getting many minutes even off the bench for Leipzig, 6 months later to be in a Liverpool team where a year ago you basically felt that you were forced to out on loan because there wasn't enough minutes available. It's hard, I think, to see a summer, unless he comes back from pre-season, a completely different player, is able to kind of establish himself this summer whilst a few of the other options are unavailable. I think it's pretty hard to see a scenario where Fabio Cavallo is anywhere near the starting 11, I think, really, in terms of the start of the season. And probably the biggest thing for me with him is that I'm still not quite sure what his position is. Okay, is he a number 10? Possibly, but we don't know whether Liverpool are going to have a number 10. If they are, it's probably not going to be him anyway, because there's probably 4 or 5 of those ahead of him. Even if he could come back and get ahead of a couple of them, there'd still be 2 or 3 players, I think, who probably are unassailable in terms of him trying to get ahead of them this summer. So it's tricky, really. He's probably not fast enough to play out on the wing. Is he defensively good enough to play as a number 8 if Liverpool play the same 4-3-3 system as what they did last season? I'm not quite sure. So I think he probably needs a loan somewhere in the Premier League. if Fulham would take him back, I think that might be ideal for him to go back there and play at that kind of level, maybe at Brentford or somewhere like that, where you can play every week, you can kind of find your position. There's a little bit less pressure on him because, obviously it's bigger pressure at Liverpool, but I think if he was to stay at Liverpool again this summer and just be a squad option and be someone who could be rotated, I think quite quickly you'd find that there wasn't that many minutes for him. There's lots of options and lots of depth that Liverpool have. Okay, he might be, a substitute for 10 minutes here and there when Liverpool are 3-0 up, but I don't think ultimately that's going to be enough to get him into the team. So I think for me, I would be looking at a loan, possibly even a permanent sale this summer. I know Arne Slot will want to look at all of these players during pre-season, and you've got to make sure that you've got enough options, but I just find it, I don't know about you, I just find it tricky to see really where the pathway to minutes is, because he's a young player, but he's not sort of Lewis Kumas age. He's at an age now where you think he could, if he wanted to, go to a mid-table Premier League club and probably play every week for them.
Yeah, I think I'd be a bit concerned if it was a permanent sale, unless there were a lot of sort of mechanisms in there, at the very least, a kind of healthy sell on and ideally some kind of buyback, because like you said, to be fair, he is a high potential player. I do like what I've seen from him so far. And those last 6 months were positives. If we just had those 6 months and we hadn't had the 6 months prior to that where he struggled in the Bundesliga, then maybe we'd be looking at it in a different light and thinking, this is a 21-year-old who was one of the brightest players in the Championship. We certainly don't want to be letting him go unless the terms are very favourable. But I agree that it's tricky to see that kind of pathway to minutes in the near term at the very least. So either trying to find that right loan again, or trying to negotiate some pretty good terms on an exit, I would say. But you never know. Like you say, pre-season he'll be one of the attackers who's back early doors, and plenty of them are away at the minute. One of whom, of course, is Darwin Núñez, who is doing very well for himself at the Copa America. Didn't quite break the 96-year-old records for scoring in consecutive Uruguay games, but he did equal it, which is pretty good going, has to be said. But does he have the starting shirt at Liverpool? That's the question. Diogo Jota, of course, the other sort of primary option through the middle. Who do you think is going to maybe get the nod from the get-go?
I think for me, the obvious one will be Diogo Jota. I get what you mean with Darwin Núñez, and he has scored a lot of goals in a row for Uruguay, but I think there is almost a bit, certainly in this country and maybe in America and other South American places where the Copa America is a little bit bigger. Maybe there's a different conversation going on about Darwin Núñez, because yes, he is scoring, but he's still missing a lot of chances as well. I don't think this is a player who will come back and suddenly be very clinical for Liverpool. I think at the moment, at least, there's still a lot of work to do really to iron out those inconsistencies. There's been more than a couple of the goals that he scored for Uruguay that I think possibly with Premier League goalkeepers rather than some of the Panama and Paraguay and various others that they've been coming up against possibly might not have gone into the back of the net. But I think he will continue to be a bit of a frustration for Liverpool. But he's at the same time so hard to sort of sum up, really. He's a player that scored 18 and assisted 13 last season. Those are not bad numbers. Clearly, they should have been a lot more with the chances that he had. I think you've just got to give him a chance at some point in terms of being in the team from the start. But he's almost similar to the point that I make with Fabio Cavallo, in that I think for Fabio Cavallo to take the next step, he's got to be in the team regularly. He's got to get a run of starts in a position that suits him. I don't really see how that's going to happen. Obviously, it's a lot more likely that Darwin Núñez can do that for Liverpool, but if Diogo Jota is fit, I think you've got to go with the more reliable and clinical of those two players. So I think that the narrative around Núñez coming back from the Copa America is positive. He will have enjoyed his time away there, whatever happens before the end of the competition. Hopefully he can score a couple more goals and come back with a bit more confidence. But I don't think we should. I don't think we should imagine that he's suddenly become this clinical player with Uruguay. The misses are still there. It's still a bit of a mixed bag for him in front of goal. And it's just going to be interesting to see really what can Arne Slot do differently with him that Jurgen Klopp wasn't. How much different is the team going to be? ultimately the issue with him wasn't really a structural one, though. It's not something that different tactics or a slightly different shape will change things. He's ultimately just got to be a bit more clinical when he's in front of goal, and I'm not necessarily convinced that in the few weeks that we've had since the last game of the Premier League season that has happened. It would be nice if that could be something that they work on during pre-season. And he's possibly one of those players where if he starts the season well and he's in the team, gets a couple of goals early on, the momentum could, happen quickly and suddenly he might explode. But I'm sort of cautiously optimistic with him at the moment. There's no chance that he's not going to be a Liverpool player next season, but I think it is a big season for him, really. If he has another season similar to the first two, I think after 3 years, you've then maybe got a bit of a conversation to be had with him. But for now, still just about the benefit of the doubt, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think he's the sort of player where you're always going to be waiting for his hot streaks because he will miss a lot of chances. He's always missed a lot of chances, even in that Benfica season where he, convinced Liverpool to sign him almost with that volume of goals he scored. There were still misses there, but it's just a case of when he can even sort of revert to the average with finishing, then suddenly his numbers do look properly elite because he is just an absolute chance magnet. I mean, again, it feels like we're going over old ground. It's the conversation we've been having pretty much since the moment he came through the door, but I think it's credit to him that does still remain the case when you look at all of the misses and all of the scrutiny and everything that's sort of come with him, all that baggage. He arrived at the same time as Haaland, and that's been a comparison he's had to deal with. He's a Uruguayan striker at Liverpool, so Suarez has obviously been mentioned, and yet with all of the misses, he's still that player who, will go and go and go again, and his chance numbers, his shot numbers are still, by far and away the highest in the Premier League even. So, Haaland's one of the few who even comes close in terms of getting in those positions. And of course, it goes without saying that you need to be finishing them off, and if you're not, then there's no point being in those positions. But the way to score them is to get in the positions, and that's what he does time and time again. And that's just that thing that means you can never quite give up on him and never quite bring yourself to say that it's not going to work out, because it just needs that run where he can get on that hot streak, and then he can be spearheading a title-winning side. He can be a key figure in that. His potential is still so high. So it's a tricky one, especially when you look at Jota, obviously almost the polar opposite in some ways. He's so clinical. In last season in particular was his best by far. I think it was almost 0.4 goals a game. He was overperforming that expected goals. He was the only player in the front line to be doing that at Liverpool. But then, of course, the question with him is, can you keep him on the pitch? How long can you keep him fit? And yeah, it's tricky to say who deserves the shirt, because, like you say, on paper it's Jota, and it's hard not to let him into the side given the form he's shown when he is fit. But he didn't cost potentially a club record fee. He's now, I think, 27. Nunez is the younger one, the one who like we talk about all the time, does have that potential to be sort of the spearhead of the future front line. So it's a dilemma for Slot. It really is, how much he kind of wants to commit to investing in the future and how much he wants to do what's right to win now, if you like. And yeah, I don't think it's an easy one to answer, and I think maybe pre-season will help to define who does have the shirt at the start of the campaign, however much of a pre-season they get, of course, with them both still being away at the minute. But yeah, it's a tricky one, and I think that pretty much sums up the front line at the minute. There's no position where you can say with any real certainty what's going to happen, except perhaps the right wing, where we can briefly talk about Mohamed Salah. I think, like you say, it's the one area where you'd maybe want to see another addition, because you look at sort of the depth chart in your head and you think, okay, we've got two left wingers, we've got two through the middle. There's not really anyone with Salah unless one of the people we've mentioned can step up. Do you see that becoming a problem, given that maybe his form was not what it could have been in the second half of the campaign? Do you think there needs to be that sort of challenger, that one who's ready to pick up the slack as he gets a little bit older?
Yeah, I think it would definitely be helpful. I think it'd be helpful as well in terms of the contract. I think if Liverpool don't have anybody else, that probably plays into his and his representatives' hands in terms of trying to get a new deal, because they can say, well, he's the only one that can really do that and is at that level, and that gives them a little bit more leverage. So I think that'll be obviously another key theme of the summer as well. We're kind of getting into the week of pre-season. I'm not entirely sure exactly when the first Liverpool players will be back in training, but it's sort of this week or the start of next week. And we still don't know much in terms of the transfer dealings, the contracts, the system that Arne Slot wants to play, all of that kind of thing. There's still lots of questions to be asked, really, which kind of makes sense in a period of change where we've got big international tournaments and all the rest of it. So it's not something I'm worried about. If anything, I'm kind of excited to see what the answers to these questions are. But I think, in short, definitely a new contract for Salah and some competition / an alternative for him to play a fewer minutes in the next couple of seasons, I think would be ideal for Liverpool this summer. It's just, again, the same as holding midfield and centre-back, really. If the right player is there, I'm sure they will probably go and do something. It's just a case of, is that perfect player on the market? And, are they still at the Euros, or are they still, away on holiday or whatever it might be for this summer? So, there's still plenty of time, I think, to get to the bottom of all of these questions.
Yeah, and I suppose with that, you have the same sort of issue you have when talking about Virgil van Dijk as at the back. Obviously, Van Dijk's right-footed, but he plays in that left-sided centre-back position. And, a lot of teams are preferring left-footers in that role now. And you look, and it's a biological fact that there's far fewer of them, and that sort of carries through to the elite level of football as well. So it's a harder one to find elite players for. And, it has to be the right player, as you say, and maybe Liverpool hasn't quite found that right player yet. But we'll hear from Arne Slot for the first time, I think, on Friday. So maybe some of those questions that we've touched upon there, maybe not get answered, but maybe he sheds a bit more light on where he's at, where his head is at with all of those things. And of course, once the games start, that's when we can really get our teeth into stuff and see what is shaping up on the pitch in terms of that front line, and of course in the transfer market as well. We'll keep you up to date with all of that over on Liverpool.com and on the Blood Red channel. In the meantime, Matt, thanks very much for joining me. Thanks everyone else for tuning in, and we'll be with you again very shortly.